So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV Podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the green energy revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
Today's guest is Hari Sripathi, former head of global strategy at Avis Budget Group. He's a big thinker in mobility innovation, an expert in fleet electrification, autonomous vehicles, and transforming legacy transportation companies from the inside out. In this episode, we dive into how autonomous vehicle adoption and electrification are converging and why fleets are the key to accelerating both. Hari, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rob. With the three bearded guys, it was my wife gave me a hard time this morning for not having shaved. So now, this is great.
No, you're in good company. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Ironically, I grew this beard out on my honeymoon a long time ago, and it was the first time my wife saw me unshaven, and she said, "All right, now you have to keep it. I like it." So I'm not allowed to shave anymore. All right, so let's talk about you right now. You've got quite a resume, including Northwestern Kellogg, an MBA over there. Talk to us about your journey from there to where you are today.
From Kellogg, well, the journey, let's start a little bit before Kellogg because I made some very fatal flaws. I was an early, let's say, full stack software developer in what is today called natural language processing. And that was 2007, 2000. It was a company called Relativity Technologies. And very early, it didn't really work, natural language. And I was a full stack developer and fundamentally came to the conclusion that, the software thing is not going anywhere. Terrible conclusion. So I wasn't the first time I made, terrible bets in my life, but
we all make mistakes.
Yeah, my mistake was, software is just, no one wants to work there. But I eventually saw that it was a black box and, you're not really, computers and human beings are very different, which may be true. But it came to Kellogg, and the only thing I wanted to do then was to work on something real. I didn't know what real meant. And to make things worse, my dad sat me down and said, look, this whatever you're doing, sitting on a computer all day, that's not a real job. And I was like, okay, what is a
Thanks,
real job
Dad.
That was my thing.
I feel like it's going to be the only job in another 10 years.
Yeah, he didn't know that, right? He was like, obviously, you need to go meet people. And so I wanted to work in an environment where, we're building tangible goods or meeting real people. And so, talked to a couple of management consulting firms. And thankfully, a company called Booz and Company, the spinoff of Booz Allen Hamilton, took me in.
Mm-hmm.
And they put me in the consumer and automotive practice. A lot of my clients were in automotives. And look, that was a time when e-commerce was taking off in a big way. Digital transformation was just about, it was a little more than a buzzword, it was just taking off. People were starting to use analytics and software to actually drive real world businesses. Airbnb had just been founded. Uber was just about being founded. And we started seeing software really get real world applications. I actually left when I, obviously with a good time at Booz and Company, I left to first lead the strategy team at PepsiCo to work on emerging markets and Quaker Oats, but quickly thereafter found my sort of really a great job at Avis Car Rental. And Avis Car Rental had also just bought Zipcar, so they were really looking at sort of solving for the future. But I joined at a very important year because it was 2018, and what had happened at that time was Uber, this small startup company that no one took seriously until then, had suddenly captured 25% market share in the airports. And the airports were always, were bought they were always considered sort of, just home base for car rental companies, right? The average person didn't even know Uber existed at that point, but they saw Uber as that was still the time when Uber would sneakily park somewhere, maybe in the drop-off.
Yeah, they weren't exactly welcome in there at the beginning.
Welcome at the airport. And so
well, they sure as hell weren't welcome in Chicago, that's for sure.
Right. And Avis was like, it's going to take them 20 years before they have dedicated lanes or anything. They're never going to get there. Oh, well, they stole 25% market share. And so suddenly they created a new role with me and they said, hey, look, solve this problem. And so I went in saying, look, we're going to have to work on the future of mobility here. How do you make the company more sort of really just change the customer experience? And at the same time, invest in these breakthrough technologies that go along with the customer journey. And those technologies are pretty well known to us today. But back then they were pretty early. It was autonomous vehicles, fairly far away. But really connected cars, that was the big bet that Avis actually did and led the market in. And it's doing very well now. Electrification and shared economy. And it's called ACES by McKinsey, CASE by some other people. So depending on what you see, right, the connected car ecosystem, the industrial Internet of Things, very successful. Avis was the first fleet to connect its entire cars, and that reduced or damaged liabilities significantly. Electrification, we were one of the early companies to actually pilot electric vehicles on our fleet. And I know we'll talk about that in a second. Shared vehicles. We were actually the first company to launch a partnership with Uber and Lyft when we realized we couldn't beat them. And this was a global trend that was going
Can't
on.
beat
We
them, join
realized that
them.
we would make money with lending our cars and renting our cars out to Uber drivers. It was a vastly successful project. And of course, the world of autonomy, which in all fairness, look, in 2019-20, we didn't do much work in there. We looked at it. It would be a huge benefit for car rental companies because a lot of our costs are, of course, labor and even things like shuttling in the maintenance hubs. But we didn't get that far on autonomy. On the connectivity, electrification, and shared, we got a long way. That was during my time. And when the pandemic hit, I was sort of at the crux of the global issue. I think I famously mispredicted how much our pandemic would cost Avis. Well, turns out I said about 15-20%, largely concentrated in Europe. And it turns out we went down by about 90%, 95%.
Ooh.
So
Oy,
my
yikes.
world was, it was awful, of course, as we all know now. But then I founded what is now called Mad Hatter Consulting, which started really to think about the world of disruption as a science, right? I'd dealt with disruption all my life, of course. I've been in software. I'd been in now the entire mobility ecosystem. I'd seen it from various different angles. And I started talking to consumer companies, largely, in the automotive space and the consumer space about how to navigate the sea change that's going on right now. And we've only seen that accelerate. That's what I do. Most of my clients tend to be sort of industrial goods companies. Some of them consumer
Mm,
companies are very, very common as well. A lot of my work last year has been in AI, a generative AI, using it for. So one of the things I'm doing right now is actually helping with mechanic training using
mm,
artificial intelligence to generate video quality animation that then can tell you how to fix a starter relay.
mm.
It's now you don't need to go read up a 10,000 page manual and find out look for the exact definition of a starter relay.
Or search on YouTube for a random video of someone making
Right,
that
right. And
repair,
you
which
on this
may or may
random
not
video entry,
exist.
right? You could go to Chris Fix. I mean, they were good, but then you need to go through, and you don't know how credible that is. Now this one can make it to OEM quality because, and then as long as you get the OEM component in 3D images, you can actually have that exactly the way the OEM intended for you to fix it.
Interesting. Wow. All right. Well, let's dial back for a second, though, because obviously this is the Urban EV podcast, and I want to hear more about especially your time over at Avis Budget
Yeah.
and the connectivity and the EV transformation. Hertz tried diving in there and failed miserably. Obviously, that was a famous swing and a miss. What was the differentiator there? How come you guys did it right and they did it
Yeah.
wrong?
I mean, I wouldn't say we did it right or they did it wrong. I'll give you the background of the story. Look, we all in 2018, 19 onwards, we realized that electric vehicles were a thing. And again, that's actually fell on my jurisdiction to sort of figure it out. I started as I think again, very maybe being naive about it at the time, but literally looked and talking to the customers of it. About 5% cared about it. About 1% really wanted it at that time. And this was 2018, 2019 at this point we're looking at. It was a technological curve. Fleet company, the OEMs were looking to sell us more electric vehicles. And that was as part of their entire portfolio. And, we were definitely the 2035 mandates they'd all promised. And so that was there. So we felt very much from Avis's point that this was very much a supply side push rather than a consumer
Mm,
demand. So we didn't move as quickly as, by the way, I actually early on when I started this, I was like, we need to move faster in this space because the consumer is growing, because we definitely saw the consumer sentiment growing. But at the end of the day, the average Avis car rental customer is about 58 years old, 51% male. At that point, range and charge anxiety was still very real. And the customer is typically going to an uncertain environment where they have a car parked in their own home. They're going into a new environment, sometimes remote, where they're not interested. They just want to get the best car possible or their nicest car possible. They tend not to want novel vehicles that they feel nervous about at that point, especially with the fuel and range anxiety. Considering the fueling even now takes about more than half an hour, even at the best of times to charge. And it's not even, you need to go looking for it. That was something that definitely scored against EVs. Now, I'll come to what I think, and I didn't work at Hertz, but where I think Hertz, or where they bet wrongly on, right? And there's another very important point that I think most of the investors miss on this, which was generally there's a promise that EVs are easier to maintain. And the promise comes from a couple of things that, of course, there's fewer components, that there's fewer moving components. They're not mechanic components anymore. You have drive by wire, brake by wire, and you have these electric signals that are sent instead to drive the car. That is true in the long run. Now, of course, the components are lower. But as it stands, again, as of the last 3 or 4 years ago, the EV industry, electric vehicle components still need to be maintained. There's still enough moving components. Number one, there's still enough moving components. And B, the skill sets to maintain those components when they go wrong is a lot harder, and the mechanics haven't been trained for that yet. So what happened often with even the EVs we piloted were very often, if you had a problem with the EV, you needed to maintain them a lot more at large scale, because you need to check them. And then often they wouldn't work with our existing processes to check them. We would check the brake oil. There wasn't any brake oil. But, what the thing is, if you actually had a problem with the EV, it took you a lot longer to fix them, because the EV, the electric vehicle, went out of business for a lot longer. That caused the problem, even at a small scale for us when we piloted it. And therefore, we walked slow with electric vehicle adoption. I'm not against it at all. I think it's an important sort of trajectory the world is on. Now, when Hertz faced bankruptcy, I think they wanted to come out and make a really bold bet and really swing for the fences.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing wrong with that. That was it, right? And they, I think reasonably, they looked at the data at the very top level and said, yeah, electric vehicles are cheaper to maintain. They are growing in a market. Younger generations are going to want them. And so they made this strategic bet to say, we're going to go after younger generations. I think what they missed is there were two options they could do, right? Either they could change the entire business model, go maybe with something like a zip car version to go after the younger generation, or they could have just not made the EV bet, existing customers that they had. Now, what they did is got that, sort of mix of strategy wrong. They just announced to the market far too prematurely, we're going to replace all our cars with EVs. To me, well, the customer wasn't there yet. Or the supply wasn't there yet either. Now, at that point, we had a handful of EV manufacturers who, of course, were trying to sell EVs. And then, they were maybe over-reliant on Tesla, effectively what happened. And they didn't have the ability to create, 600,000 cars in a span of 2-3 years. They didn't produce that many for a rental car fleet. And you had Chevy Bolts and, all the other OEMs also had electric vehicles. They just didn't have the ability to produce that many cars. And then if you got the cars, the aftermarket components were not easy to get. The mechanics simply weren't trained. And that led to this horrible crisis where, well, the cars weren't ready. Well, the consumers went home empty-handed, or they stood on crazy long lines, which just hurts in a terrible way. Now, those problems are also there at Avis, but we did well because Hertz was doing even worse.
Mm.
So, in all fairness, I think the electric vehicle mandate at Hertz was just poorly executed.
Hari, there's one more thing here, and this is what's interesting and fun here of having this podcast, because we speak to a lot of people. And there's one more angle here that I believe you've not hit upon, and that is the user experience. The confusion when a consumer has never driven an EV before, rents one. How does this work? How do I charge? Where do I find the chargers? Matt Teskey from ChargeWay, he works directly with OEMs and rental car companies. His software basically is a kind of educational tool, and it's also a route planning tool, and it's a color-coded, it's very simplified, kind of almost dumbed down, so that people on the very first impression can kind of understand and figure out how to charge their cars. But I believe that was a massive problem as well. You have a really negative user experience. Someone doesn't understand how this works. I'm in a new place, a new city, a new country. How does this work? And now I got to deal with charging this thing. I don't even know where to plug it in or how this works or how fast it's going to be or what's available. So I think that was another strike against the whole early EV unrolling with the car rental agencies.
That's a really interesting point, because part of what we earlier thought was EVs are cool, so they're going to bring the younger consumers in. But the point that you just made is actually very real, because the mindset the customer is in when they're in a new place, when they're typically for business travel, they just want to get in and go to their meeting, or they're leisure travelers with a family and a couple of screaming kids, who knows, angry, spouse. Well, that's not the time you want to be experimenting with something new either.
No, that's exactly it.
Boy, is Rob learning that now.
So that's exactly the sort of situations that I think the rental car companies didn't get right. They didn't understand the consumer. They didn't understand the mindset. The user experience wasn't there. Well, in all fairness, EVs are nice to drive, but not at that occasion.
Mm-hmm. Even for me, I'm going to admit this. I'm going to be transparent on this podcast right now. I was just in Portugal just several weeks ago, and I had to rent a car. And I had the opportunity to rent an EV, and I didn't. Because I wasn't sure what the network would be like when I arrived.
Yeah.
No, but I think that's fair. I mean, I think to Hari's point, the last thing you want when you're in a foreign environment, and a particularly foreign environment in Europe for you, is to have the unknowns, and you are there with your family. Like, You can't be in an unknown place and be unsure about whether you're going to make it where you need to get to go, you know?
It's an added level of uncertainty. Ironically, Scott, Portugal's an EV paradise. Turns out it was
Yeah, no.
maybe the best place on the planet
Yeah.
to rent an EV. I did rent a stick, so I got a chance to have fun with a 5-speed. So in the end, it worked out all right. But that country is mature. And this is the whole thing. It's all about timing, right? Especially in 2018, 2019. And even in many parts of the US today, the networks aren't fully mature yet, although they're really getting there in a lot of areas. So I feel like the timing for the rental fleets now is kind of starting to come around again. So do you feel these early teething pains, we've worked through them right now? What's the outlook? I know you're no longer with Avis Budget anymore. Where do you see fleets going in the next 5 years?
I think the fleet OEMs are going to push it a little more. It's going to be complicated because we just have a new administration that's not prioritizing electric vehicles a similar way, right? I think Hertz has learned a really tough lesson. So I think this pendulum's going to swing the other way. So specifically for car rentals, I think they're going to still walk it slow, in all fairness. It is facing broader challenges with the Ubers and the economies of the world. They're looking to just focus more on digital transformation at this point rather than the electric vehicle transformation. And the OEMs are no longer pushing as much as they were a couple of months ago. So to me, I don't think electrification is going to be as big a priority at this point. It will in the long run, but I actually don't think that that large fleets are going to go electric, especially passenger, single owner, single rider, large fleet are probably not rental cars.
So, Hari, I know you recently wrote an article kind of how mobility may truly hasten this AV adoption. And AV, for the Rob acronym haters out there, is autonomous vehicles. So just to cover our bases on that, tell me more about how you think, I mean, obviously, if it's autonomous, it's going to be an EV. Tell me more about how you think that adoption is going to hasten because of that.
I think I specifically shared about May Mobility as partnership with Technobus, which is
exactly.
Well, so there's two angles there. There's autonomous vehicles, I think, and then let's talk about autonomous vehicles as a whole, right? Which I think for the most part, the current US focused autonomous vehicles industry, Waymo and Tesla being the big ones, have focused on robo-taxis, which is the classic, they're going after rental cars, they're going after Uber, and those there's two promises they both make, which is they're going to be safer and they're going to reduce congestion. They're not going to reduce congestion because they're basically going to make it easier for you to get a single rider car all the time. So number one, right? They're also variable route, which is, and they're go pick you up from your house to drop you off wherever, which is actually operationally very complicated because you've got a robo taxi getting liquid, needing to be very liquid in that it needs to be circling around a large population center to get that driver every time. Sure, you're going to get a lot more empty miles, basically empty cars driving around the street. So congestion is not going to be
cruising. Yeah, that's like the old New York City taxi model, the yellow cab.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and just all the time. Then they're going to be empty all the time. So you're going to get, that's not helping at all. And for safety as well, yes, over time, they're safer than a human, but you see this large amount, they're still going to be, I think at least, they're still going to need to be maintained and cleaned multiple times a day. Sort of like an airline to a certain extent. The sensor gets displaced a little bit. Now the car drives somewhere else, right? So it's not the robo-taxi, I think, is sort of the, yes, they're electric, absolutely, but, we're going up the wrong trajectory in my mind. When May Mobility is one of of course, the startup that is basically sort of is riding on safety and accessibility to everyone. And they're trying to make autonomous vehicles democratized to suburban owners. When they launched this partnership with Technobus, it was interesting to me because Technobus is one of the world's smallest buses. Now, America is a country where bus transport is not very common, maybe except New York City. But really, when they said, okay, we're going to launch robo-taxis, but really with robo-buses, that made things really interesting to me because what it tells me is to the point that Rob was just mentioning on the user experience and the willingness of customers to adopt new things, that's a lot easier in a shared environment. Scott, if I saw you on the bus already, yeah, sure, I'll try it. All right, if something happens, both of us sing together, or we enjoy it together. But so the fact that they're prioritizing shared transport was a huge, I think, and is going to really push the industry forward. Now, Technobus is a small company at this point. They've made, they've not made too many buses. They've, I think, made less than 100 buses. Fact check me on that if you want. But the fact that they were willing to bring shared transport as the sort of early adopter autonomous vehicle is a good thing because shared transport is another advantage if they could make it fixed route. which
Mhm.
therefore you don't have to learn all these crazy other thousands of iterations of priority. You could make it arterial roads or semi-arterial roads, and you could increase the definition of arterial roads because of the size of the vehicle is smaller or larger, and you could use bus lanes, and so the car can learn the route much better. It can serve more people, getting them more comfortable with autonomous vehicles. It's operationally easier, and you can actually pay for the safety technicians and the maintenance because now you have many more. You're probably making more money than an average Uber is because you have that many more riders. If you have more than 4 or 5 riders, you're probably making more money than Uber. So you have the economics to pay for a safety technician. You have the economics to pay for maintenance. I think, therefore, the autonomous vehicle industry gets pushed forward.
Well, I think there's precedent for this, particularly in Europe, because you see all of these shared carpooling services popping up. So BlaBlaCar, Hoop Car, all of these. It's built into the culture. So particularly in France and Spain, in Paris specifically for commuters, they're transporting 40,000 people a day, and they've just got started. And you can actually use your Parisian transit card to pay for 2 rides a day using something like BlaBlaCar. So that I feel like the behavior is already baked in. It's not so baked in the States yet, but I think it will come.
You know what,
But I
Scott?
think, yeah.
Scott, they tried to roll out something like this here in New York. I think it was called Chariot. It was backed by Ford, and I don't know if it failed because it wasn't adopted, or if it failed because of COVID, because that's right around the time it disappeared.
Yeah, so I've followed Chariot reasonably well. I've spoken to some of the founders there. EVs could make that model better. I think Chariot had some leadership misalignment issues back in the day. They were also too early to sell to a company like Ford. It was a beta product when they launched, and then Ford basically killed them effectively because they'd made them focus on one fleet, which was, not a very good fleet, the Ford Transit
Yeah.
van, which was also not very comfortable to
My
begin with.
God.
And they were just going after the transit routes. They were going after the 7 train or the L train.
I remember this. Yeah,
Right, the L
yeah,
train.
yeah,
They just
yeah.
basically followed the L train. And I think they learned very late to go after real estate and private developers and have custom routes on their own. They were crowdsourcing their routes, which at
Mm-hmm.
that time, but there was no fancy model to it. But I think that could do better now with robo-taxi data, right? And it was also sort of, if you think about it, there was a very important reason why at that time, there's a framing issue. That was sort of early. Uber was just about launching, wasn't really in the public imagination just yet. Taxis, the yellow taxis, was the incumbent. Everybody complained about the yellow taxis, right? They were dirty, but no one complained that they were cheap. They weren't cheap.
No.
Then
Yeah.
Uber came along, and it became the fancier version of the taxi, slightly more expensive, but allowed you to customize your ride. And then Chariot comes along and saying, well, we're cheap. Well, no one cared about that at that point.
Yeah.
Well,
Now
but I
it
will
became
say,
right.
do you remember Via?
Via did the same thing, but Via had, again, very, very specific, very, very on-demand models. I don't know exactly why they got out of New York City. They're doing very well.
No, they didn't. So what they've done is and I think they're perfectly positioned to enter into a similar position as May Mobility. What they've done is they've pivoted to essentially on-demand transit. So exactly what you're talking about. They partner with local municipalities, and they optimize their transit systems using demand. So essentially, you open an app very similar to the Via app that they had in New York, and you say, "I'm trying to go from my house to Target." And then it basically crowdsources a bunch of other people that are going generally the same direction, tells you go to this corner and wait for the bus, which is an actual bus in some cases. You get on, and then all of you go to Target. And so it's not that you're going 17 stops between your house and Target. They found 10 other people that all want to go to Target that live nearby you, and they get you to Target pretty much direct. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it's cheap.
Via is absolutely, I think, one of the players to watch in this space for sure, because they sort of have the software and the routing infrastructure, probably the West.
Totally.
But I do want to make one thing about Chariot. One thing, the framing of the problem is different now because the incumbent is now Uber and Lyft, right? Uber and Lyft are expensive. They're very fancy car, nice car, but they're expensive. They're traditionally seen as sometimes unsafe, which again, the robo-bus can solve. Cheaper, of course. Now the cheaper argument works that Chariots 8-9 years ago didn't work.
Totally.
But aren't they also going to be competing against the robo-taxis? I mean, obviously right now in Austin, Texas, Waymo, Tesla supposedly next, you remove the driver, it gets cheaper again. I don't think that Uber has a safety reputation. I think people feel safe in those vehicles for the most part. It seems like they've kind of ironed out all the kinks in the system there with weird drivers, kind of creeper types and what have you. And the rating system seems to keep everyone honest. So I feel people do feel safe in those cars in more ways than one, but it is expensive. It's gotten crazy expensive. We have good robust transit here in Brooklyn where I live. I'm taking a city bike. I'm taking public transportation. I'm
So
walking.
I think
I'm avoiding Uber unless I'm going to the airport.
absolutely. I think that there's definitely a push for more value transportation. And by the way, cities that provide democratized transport win. They build bigger economies. There's huge second order and third order effects of transport.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, Rob will tell you, I live in Valencia, and it's one of the strongest economies in Spain because of their rampant support of multimodal public and private transportation. I mean, short of there being a shared electric mobility option here for bicycles, there's everything, every flavor. And in fact, actually, there were 3 shared electric moped services offered here, and there's a 4th one now that just launched last week. So it helps, as you say, it helps grow the economy. And
Absolutely.
Again, the adoption of things like BlaBlaCar here are totally teeing up what you're talking about with May Mobility, this idea of shared autonomous transportation. I think one of the questions I have about that, and something that was been interesting to me, and I call these things the kind of like autonomous toasters. You know, everyone's building these vehicles it doesn't look like a car, it looks like a toaster.
Zooks. Yeah,
Yeah,
that kind
all
of style.
those,
Yeah.
you know, where they're yeah, and they're all kind of in these controlled environments. Tell me more about what you think in terms of how that's going to maybe make people even more comfortable with this idea of autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, I mean the leader in that space you're talking about, not toasters, but those are sort of those contained vans. I think they're calling them modular automated transit or something, or semi.
Something like that. They have a dozen ridiculous names for them, but that's why I just call them toasters because it looks like a toaster.
Yes, to your point, controlled environments, right? There's a couple of environments where like Oxa, the software, they're building software, but they've gotten a long way in building industrial automation bots. They could fix it to any fleet like a golf cart, and then as long as it goes in some crazy industrial zone, it's doing its work. It's checking solar forms for fires. It's instead of drones, lots of stuff. There's the beeps of the world, which are largely passenger mobility for very controlled environments like airports, and they're fine, right? There's actually a couple of them doing similar things. I think Pony.ai, I would say the Chinese are a little bit ahead in this game than the American companies are. So I think like Pony.ai, because the reason is some of them have started testing with much more dense and larger variety of data. So they've tested in more complicated environments, Pony. So they're building, I would say WeRide already launched a shared bus service in Guangzhou. Guangzhou is a big city in
it's huge.
in China, and I think Seoul is launching too. Seoul, Korea, South Korea. So there, that sort of thing. I think the robo-buses. I think East Asia, China in specific, are a little bit ahead of the United States. All right, Beep is probably the market leader in the space. They've had their own challenges with various supplier turnarounds. Their cars still their whole on bus is still years away from development, and then we don't know how good the Tesla robo-van will launch either. It's a concept at this point. We don't know.
That's almost vaporware, in my opinion.
We don't know. But
yeah,
exactly. So it could be vaporware, and same thing with the Beep Polon, right? It's not vaporware. It's real, but it's not been in production. It's in Jacksonville, Florida. Can it get out of look? I don't personally think there's going to be multiple use cases in this, right? And it's still the jury's out on whether autonomous vehicles are going to be as agnostic as normal buses are. You could use a bus anywhere at this point, a normal ICE bus. The market could fragment a little bit and say, okay, there's going to be user specific, fleet. There's going to be industrial automation bots, and there's going to be, let's say, airport specific geofence bots, and then there's going to be the passenger common modes transport, which is partly geofenced, and some of them may be the Tesla model, which is not geofenced. That's still an emerging field. I feel excited about the shared transport field, to be honest with you. I also like Karsan. Karsan is a Turkish manufacturer. They're traditionally a bus manufacturer. They're coming out with an autonomous vehicle soon, I think in the next 6 months. And they've got their software development team in Michigan. Those guys are building a bus, I believe, that can both be autonomous and be driver driven when necessary. So that solves the problem of what if some extreme situation happens, like a flood happens or the fire happens in the middle of the road, or, and those are pretty common when you're driving a bus, or some guy standing in the street doesn't want to move and your route has to be changed the last minute, something like that.
So, Hari, can you just look in your crystal ball right now and tell us what you think transportation as a service is going to look like by
Service.
2030?
Well, 2030 is pretty close. You want to say service?
You're right. Maybe we really have to talk in decades
Okay,
here,
fine.
although I love to hear what the
Fair
immediate
enough,
future is
fair
like.
enough,
Let's
fair
say the next 10 plus
let's
years.
do both. Let's do, because both is
Yeah.
one of the 5 years actually harder than the 10-year, right? I think, look, autonomous robo-taxis are already there. You're going to start seeing them in 5 years. You're going to start seeing them actually break some of their promises of, I think, congestion and maybe even safety, but at the same time be there. So consumers are going to start getting, starting to use to those robo taxis, and they're going to start complaining about them, or some of them are going to like them. I do think the robo buses or robo shared vehicles, whatever you want to call them, are going to be much more critical, and people are going to realize that in 3 or 4 years' time, right? And especially these cities where the robo taxi deployments have gone. We're probably going to see, I think at this point, if you want to look at it, I think the American manufacturers at this point a little bit behind the Chinese manufacturers. So I think we're going to, depending on how these trade wars and all that go, we could see some more Chinese products, or we could have a ring fencing of there's a Western world model and there's going to be a Chinese model. We don't know that yet. It's going to depend on geopolitics. But I think that currently, if you look at BYD versus Tesla, if you look at BYD, of course, has a bigger consumer market. But if you go to a market like Mexico, what surprised me recently on a trip to Mexico City was you see a lot more BYDs than Teslas. And Mexico historically been a very, very U.S. Heavy U.S. product heavy country, and you see a lot more DD than DoorDash. So that's happening. I think that some of these companies, the U.S. companies, have to start thinking much more globally. The U.S. is not just the only market.
Yeah.
That's not the current environment. So 5 years from now, I think that we're going to see a lot more robo-taxis. We're going to start seeing shift towards more demand from robo-buses. We're not there yet. 10 years from now, yes, I think that those things are going to start coming into play. We're going to start seeing actual replacement of passenger fleet with robo vehicles. Drivers and mechanics are going to be in shorter supply. It's going to be a very different job than what it is today. A lot more AI and maintenance work. That sort of stuff is probably going to be used on a regular basis in regular cars. Drive-by-wire and brake-by-wire are going to be real in every car. It's going to be impossible to find a car without that. I would argue that you're going to see at least 50% of cars being electric. I think that's reasonable to say in 10 years because you're ironing out some of the political disruptions. I think at least 50% of the cars are going to be electric because remember, many of these fleet manufacturers have already committed to that 4, 7, 10 years ago. So they're going to go, that's going to start happening. And once you get past 35, 40% EVs, that's the end goal, right? You're not going to find ICEs.
That's right? The tipping point. Yep.
That's the tipping point, exactly. So once you get beyond the 33, 45, 40, the 33, 35, 40%, you're going to get past the tipping point. And you're not going to see internal combustion engines anymore. So yes, 10 years from now, I do think that EVs are going to be the way. You're going to start seeing much better infrastructure. That's going to be a complicated thing because you're going to have dense city infrastructure. Rural infrastructure is still, I think it's questionable. You're going to start seeing the big oil and gas players, the BP, the Shells of the world, start to encourage or just start making money on electric charging because
they're dipping their toes right now, right, Hari? I mean, they're already starting with some BPs with their charging network. They're hedging a little bit. Yeah,
they're hedging right now, and it's still, I think, this year, next 2, 3 years, or at least going to be still hedging. But that's going to change, right? Because you're going to realize that energy is a lot cheaper, energy. And yes, the big problem we're all going to have to solve is, can you make it faster to charge? It costs, it takes you 2 minutes to put in the gas, and it takes you half an hour to maybe even more than that to park, get your car charged. Maybe battery replacement that's very common in China. It's failed a couple of times in developed countries, including, I think, famously in Israel. And in the West, maybe we're going to start solving those problems in 10 years.
Awesome. Hari, I believe that does it for time over here, but I really want to thank you for being on the show and bringing the kind of insight that only comes with, from you sitting at the crossroads of the corporate transformation and emerging technology.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Rob and Scott. Really appreciate it.
If you're in the business of moving people or packages, this episode should be a wake-up call. Because AVs and EVs aren't parallel futures, they're clearly on a collision course. You can find Hari and his consulting work at hiremadhather.com. A reminder to follow us on LinkedIn, like, subscribe, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Your review or feedback is always appreciated. The road to sustainability starts at the plug, and that's why we're here. We will see you all next week on a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.